I had been teaching music at Hammond Elementary School in Charleston for nearly 3 years when my life shifted on what should have been an entirely ordinary September afternoon. A meeting with Mrs. Jenkins about her son's progress in piano had stretched longer than expected, and by the time I stepped out of the ivy-covered historic building, the late-day sunlight had already spilled gold across Marion Square, where ancient oaks whispered things that felt older than memory. I tightened my grip on the worn strap of my old leather bag, letting my mind drift through the quiet list of evening plans, grading papers, preparing the next day's rhythm lesson, maybe calling my college roommate after too many postponed attempts. Then I heard the crying before I saw her. A thin, desperate sound, trembling with heartbreak, rose from the row of benches near the fountain, pulling my chest taut, as though some invisible thread had hooked straight into my heart. A little girl sat curled in on herself, her dark brown curls veiling her face, her small shoulders shaking with every broken sob. Her cream-colored dress looked expensive, her leather shoes polished to a shine, yet the stuffed bear in her arms was so worn it had only one eye left. I scanned the area. No frantic parent, no panicked nanny. The park was strangely quiet except for a few joggers wearing headphones and a pair of tourists hunched over a map. No one seemed to notice the child falling apart on the bench. I had never been good at walking past a child in distress. Maybe that was why I became a teacher in the first place. I approached slowly, lowering myself to her eye level while keeping just enough distance so I would not frighten her. "Sweetheart, are you all right? Are you lost?" The girl lifted her head, and her wide brown eyes stopped my breath for a moment. They were flooded with tears, worry, and a primal fear I had only ever seen in children who carried deep wounds. She spoke, but her voice was thick with sobs, the words dissolving before they reached me. "Can you tell me your name? I'm Emily. I teach music," I repeated gently, slower this time. The girl answered again, clearer, yet she chose to speak in Italian. The sound was soft and melodic, a little song in itself, and it took me a few seconds to realize what language it was. My grandmother had spoken Italian, and I had studied a small amount in college, partly to feel closer to my roots, partly because I loved the musical quality of the language. I glanced down at the bear in her arms and noticed tiny embroidered letters on its tiny vest. Orsetto. Definitely Italian. I took a steady breath, digging through the dusty corners of memory, piecing together the words I still remembered. "Come ti chiami?" I asked slowly. She blinked in surprise, then whispered, "Sophia." "Sophia," I repeated with a small smile. "What a beautiful name. My name is Emily. Mi chiamo Emily." Sophia was still crying, but her sobs softened. I tried to recall more simple conversations my grandmother had taught me, fragments that now felt like the only fragile bridge between me and this lost child. "Dove sono I tuoi genitori?" I asked where her parents were. She shook her head over and over, tears spilling again, speaking a hurried stream of words from which I caught only fragments. "Papa, paura." I sat on the bench beside her, still keeping space, thinking quickly. What helps children calm down? Music. Always music. My grandmother had sung me to sleep every night after my mother died. An old Italian lullaby. Its melody sad and gentle like a pair of arms gathering you close. The tune returned to me suddenly, warm and familiar. Before I could hesitate, I began humming softly. Sophia stopped crying. She stared at me, her eyes wide, as I started to sing in Italian slowly, hoarsely, but with every ounce of feeling I had. Words from childhood flowed out of me as though they had been waiting. And in that moment, with the golden light filtering through the ancient branches, I did not yet know that this song would be the thread pulling me into an entirely different world, a world of secrets, unhealed wounds, and a man whose eyes would change everything I thought I understood about love. If the moment Emily sang the Italian lullaby that soothed Sophia and drew Daniel Romano into her life touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel, press like, and share this video so we can continue bringing heartfelt, emotional stories every day. And tell us, from which city or country are you watching? Leave a comment below so I know how far this little lullaby has traveled across our wide world. My voice kept trembling through the final notes as emotion rose faster than breath. Sophia did not take her eyes off me, her lips parting slightly as though she were trying to grasp something familiar. When I drew out the last line, she whispered, so softly it brushed past my ear like wind, "Mama, used to sing that." The words swept through my chest like a cold gust. I nodded gently, steadying myself so I would not cry in front of a child already drowning in sorrow. "My grandmother used to sing it to me," I answered in Italian. "She was Italian, like your mother, wasn't she?" Sophia nodded and hugged her bear tighter, then surprised me by inching slightly closer, something that had seemed impossible only minutes earlier. Trust had begun to form between us, delicate but real. We sat in silence for several moments, listening to the fountain, the sparrows, and the wind carrying the last warmth of the afternoon. I was just reaching for my phone to call the police or Child Protective Services when a black SUV rolled up to the curb across the street. Its door opened and a man stepped out, dressed sharply but without ostentation, tall and broad-shouldered, with a presence that made the air around him shift. His eyes swept the park before landing on Sophia beside me. He moved, quickly, each step carrying urgency and authority. When Sophia saw him, her eyes filled again, but this time with relief. "Papa!" she cried, her voice breaking open. The man rushed forward, dropping to his knees and pulling her into a fierce embrace. Holding her so tightly, I could almost feel the love and terror he had been carrying. I stood and stepped back to give them space, but he looked up at me with eyes that were stern and deeply grateful. "You were with her?" he asked in a resonant American voice. I nodded. I heard her crying. No one else was nearby. She wouldn't speak English, so I used the Italian my grandmother taught me to comfort her. He studied me more intently. "You sang?" Heat crept up my neck. "Just an old lullaby. My grandmother used to sing it. Sophia said her mother sang it too." His expression shifted, as though a door inside him opened suddenly, revealing something raw. He rose, still holding his daughter, and his voice dropped, slow and heavy with disbelief. Only her mother knew that song. A chill ran through me, a feeling that I had stepped onto ground I was not meant to tread. He looked at me for a long moment, searching my face for something he could not name. Then he exhaled, a breath woven with relief and exhaustion. "My name is Daniel Romano. Thank you, Emily." I cannot remember what I said next. Perhaps you're welcome, perhaps something polite. But all I heard echoing in my head was his quiet statement. Only her mother knew that song. I did not ask further. Not out of fear, but because I sensed a wound not yet healed, a door he was not ready for anyone to open. A man who had lost his wife, a child who had lost her mother, a lullaby bridging two fractured worlds. Daniel lifted Sophia into his arms and signaled to a waiting bodyguard near the SUV. Before leaving, he looked back at me once more, briefly but unmistakably, and I knew he would not forget me. I stood there as the late afternoon, light washed over every brick of the Charleston Park, my heart heavy with questions that had no answers yet. I did not know then that this moment was the first step into a story where music, memory, and love would fold into a melody I would carry for the rest of my life. I did not see Daniel Romano again immediately after that afternoon, yet his face, the way his gaze seemed to pierce through everything, and especially the sentence he spoke kept echoing through my mind for days afterward. Only her mother knew that song. His words were not an accusation, but they planted in me a strange and fragile unease, as though I had stepped into something sacred, something so private that no one was meant to touch it. In the following days, I returned to my routine at Hammond School, teaching music to small, restless children, adjusting the little orchestra's attempt at a symphony, and occasionally grading homework for the handful of students who always drifted off mid-lesson. Yet each time I sat at the piano in the practice room, the melody of that Italian lullaby rose in my mind unbidden, as if Sophia were still whispering it from some corner of my memory that I had not yet learned to tuck away. I did not tell anyone what had happened that day, though I could not fully explain why. Perhaps it felt too intimate, too strange to reduce into words. 4 days later, on a Saturday morning touched by gentle sunlight, as I was rearranging stacks of music books in my small home office, the doorbell rang. I was not expecting anyone, certainly not anything of importance. But when I opened the door, a tall man stood before me, unfamiliar, dressed in a simple yet elegant gray suit, his expression solemn, his voice deep and steady. "Are you Miss Emily Hart?" he asked. I nodded, my hand still resting on the door handle. "My name is Marco. I work for Mr. Romano. He would like to meet with you, if you have time." I stepped back slightly, my heartbeat stumbling off rhythm. For a moment, Daniel Romano?" I asked. The man nodded again. "He is very grateful for what you did for little Sophia. He would like to thank you. And he has a serious proposal." I hesitated only for a few seconds before some quiet instinct inside me rose and refused to let me decline. 1 hour later, I found myself standing inside an old mansion in the south of Broad District, the kind of home that, at a single glance, made it clear its occupants never worried about utility bills. The house bore the unmistakable touch of classic Italian architecture, from the wrought iron floral gate to the polished granite steps leading up to the grand porch. Marco guided me through a long marble hallway past a library, with shelves stretching all the way to the ceiling, a sitting room so quiet it resembled a museum, and finally into a smaller room where sunlight poured gently through tall glass windows. Daniel Romano was seated there, a coffee cup in hand. When he saw me, he rose, his expression composed yet alert. "Thank you for coming," he said, motioning for me to sit. "I don't quite know how to say this, but since that day, Sophia has talked about you every single day." His words surprised me more than I expected, though I kept my voice calm. "I didn't do anything extraordinary," I murmured. "I just happened to be there, at the right moment." Daniel nodded slowly, yet his eyes were more serious now. For a child who has just lost her mother, anyone who appears at the right moment is a miracle. But what I cannot ignore is the song. He paused, his gaze fixed on mine. "I always believed Alessia, my wife, was the only one who knew that lullaby. She never taught it to anyone. She never sang it in public. And yet Sophia recognized it the moment you began to sing. I do not believe that was a coincidence." I felt something tighten inside my chest, not fear, but something nearer to emotion, a trembling recognition. I answered softly, "My grandmother used to sing that song when I was little. She was Italian, from the Naples region." I did not fully understand the lyrics until I grew older. Daniel remained still for a long moment before setting his cup down and interlacing his fingers. "I am looking for someone who can teach piano to Sophia. At home. She does not adapt well in classroom settings. And you are the first person who has made her smile again in more than a year. I know this is sudden, but I want you to consider it." I looked at him then and, for the first time, saw a man who was powerful, yet profoundly weary. His weariness did not diminish him. It brought him closer to something real, a father clinging to the last piece of goodness left in his life. I did not answer him right away. But deep down, I already knew I had said yes long before he asked. I returned to the mansion on a warm Monday morning, beneath a sky so clear it made Charleston look like a frame from an old film. Marco greeted me at the gate, this time with a polite smile that held far less tension than before. The wrought iron gate opened into a vast garden fragrant with lavender and lined with old rose trees, each one trimmed with a precision bordering on devotion. I climbed the marble steps and stepped through the heavy wooden door into a home scented with cedarwood and strong coffee. The air inside was still quiet but warmer than during my first visit, no longer carrying the cautious chill of a stranger entering a guarded world. An older woman in a white apron approached and introduced herself as Maria, the longtime housekeeper of the Romano family. She led me down a corridor of dark stone floors, lined with oil paintings and old black and white photographs, until we reached a pair of frosted glass doors that opened into a music room. The room was flooded with natural light, its high ceiling giving it a soft echo, the arched windows overlooking the garden beyond. At the center stood a glossy black Steinway piano, grand and solemn like a king resting on his throne. Beside it sat a carved ebony music stand and a deep red velvet bench. I stood there speechless until a soft voice drifted behind me, light as the sound of wind tapping a glass window. "Miss Emily?" I turned to find Sophia standing in the doorway, wearing a pale pink linen dress, her dark curls tied to one side with a white ribbon. She was barefoot on the polished wood floor, clutching the same worn-out stuffed bear as the day I met her. Her eyes no longer held panic, though there was still a thin layer of caution, like mist that had not yet learned to lift. I crouched slightly, offering her a gentle smile. "Hello, Sophia. I'm very happy to see you again." She watched me for a few quiet seconds before giving a shy nod. Without a word, she walked slowly into the room and perched on the edge of the piano bench, her small legs swinging above the floor. I approached and sat beside her, keeping just enough distance so she would not feel pressed. "Do you like playing the piano?" I asked. She looked at the instrument before glancing back at me. "My mother used to play, very beautifully." Her tiny voice carried no tears this time, and the word mother fell into the space between us with a weight that softened everything around it. I nodded gently, feeling something in me loosen at the sound of that memory. "If you want," I said softly, "I can teach you a very easy song today. You do not need to play well. You only need to enjoy it." Sophia hesitated, then placed her bare on the floor and rested her small hands on the keys, trembling slightly as if touching something sacred. I opened a simple lullaby sheet I had brought, a wordless melody of only a few gentle notes. I guided her through each key and rhythm, and she repeated them. The first notes she played were clumsy but determined. She frowned in concentration, glancing at me each time she hit a wrong note. I smiled in encouragement. "It's all right. Everyone begins with a wrong note." Sophia smiled, the first real smile I had seen from her. In that moment, the room brightened, not from the sun but from something lighter than breath, something like trust being born. When the lesson ended, Sophia reached out and held my hand, asking shyly, "Will you come again, tomorrow?" I squeezed her small fingers gently. "If you want, I will come every day." Beyond the window, Daniel stood at a distance, watching through the curtain, his hand tightening when he saw his daughter holding the hand of a stranger, as if she had found her first anchor after the storm. And I realized, without knowing exactly when it had happened, that this house no longer felt unfamiliar. Our first official lesson took place on Wednesday morning, only 2 days after our brief meeting in the music room. I arrived early, carrying printed sheet music, a small wooden rhythm box, and a tin of butter cookies shaped like piano keys I had baked the night before. When Marco opened the door, he gave only a small nod and guided me directly to the music room, suggesting Daniel had already instructed everything that needed saying. Sophia was already seated at the piano, wearing a light blue dress, her hair neatly tied, her bear resting beside her on a lace-covered stool. She looked at me with a mixture of anticipation and the fragile fear that everything good might disappear if she blinked too hard. I smiled and held up the cookie tin. "Today we'll learn a new piece and enjoy something sweet. How does that sound?" Sophia's shy grin told me I had managed to step a little deeper into her guarded world. After warm-ups and rhythm games, I introduced a fairy tale-like melody, gentle but with just enough challenge to make her feel a little older, a little braver. She watched closely as I demonstrated, her eyes following the movement of my fingers. When it was her turn, she placed her hands carefully on the keyboard, still leaning, noticeably toward one side, as if avoiding the left section of the piano. I did not comment, only made a quiet note in my mind. Halfway through the lesson, I suggested a break. While Sophia ate her cookies and sipped her milk, I wandered the room, admiring the paintings. One portrait showed a slender woman playing the piano, her long wavy hair falling gently as she smiled with her eyes. I looked back at the Steinway and noticed a faint scratch along its left edge. When I brushed my fingertips over it, I caught a glimpse of tiny Italian words carved into the wood, per Alessia, con tutta l'anima. I whispered the translation in my mind, for Alessia, with all my soul. And suddenly, I understood why Sophia avoided that side of the instrument. Perhaps that was where her mother once sat. Perhaps that was a corner of memory she was not yet ready to touch. When I turned around, Sophia was watching me with quiet curiosity, as if asking a question she did not know how to form. I sat beside her, again, and gently nudged her bench toward the center. "Let's sit right in the middle today," I said softly. "The way your mother used to sit. Is that all right?" She hesitated, then nodded, barely perceptible but brave. This time she did not avoid the left side of the piano. The lesson continued with a small duet in which I played the lower notes and she played the higher ones. At first it sounded messy, but gradually the notes found each other, blending into a warm, unbroken thread of sound. When the piece ended, I looked back and saw Daniel standing in the doorway, the light from the hall casting him in a half-shadow. He said nothing, only watched his daughter with a look as deep as the bottom of a still lake. Sophia ran to him and he knelt to gather her in his arms, one hand holding her tightly while the other came to rest lightly on my shoulder in a wordless gesture of gratitude. When I left the mansion, Marco escorted me to my car. Before driving off, I glanced back through the window. The house, with all its invisible cracks, now held a faint glow from one small corner. The old piano had begun to sing new notes again, and I realized that I was not simply teaching a child how to play music. I was helping a soul remember how to live. 3 weeks after Sophia's very first lesson, she had already memorized 3 simple pieces, remembered the keys with confidence, and began to maintain a steady rhythm. Each time I arrived, she was already seated in the music room with her familiar stuffed bear, and a bright anticipation in her eyes that I had never seen on that very first day. I never told her, but I understood deeply that music was healing her in ways no therapist had been able to reach. Yet, even though she had become comfortable with the piano, had begun speaking both English and bits of Italian, there was one thing Sophia still never did. She did not sing. She never hummed along, never repeated lyrics, not even when I demonstrated the simplest melodies. I never pushed. I knew there were wounds that opened only when the soul was ready, and Sophia felt like a piece of music with a rest far longer than anyone realized. But still, I hoped that each day, each note, would bring her closer to the voice I knew she had once carried inside her. One Monday morning, I brought a new piece of music. It had no lyrics, only a delicate sequence of notes written in the style of old Italian compositions, inspired by the lullaby I had sung in the park that first day. I left it untitled, writing only 2 simple Italian words at the top, per Sophia. She looked at the sheet, then up at me, and she smiled a small, honest smile that warmed something quiet inside my chest. We began learning the melody line by line, with me playing first and Sophia repeating after. When we reached the refrain, I hummed softly, without words, just a gentle open vowel sound that floated over the notes. At first, she did not react, but when I stopped to let her play alone, I heard something faint, a sound thin as air, like wind. A single fragile hum slipped from her lips, barely a breath but unmistakably a song. I did not lift my head, not wanting to startle her. I simply kept tapping the rhythm lightly so she could stay with the music. Then she hummed a second phrase, longer this time. I pretended not to notice, but my heart was beating so hard I could feel it in my throat because I knew exactly what was happening. Sophia was unlocking the very last door she had slammed shut when her mother died. When the piece ended, I remained still. Sophia remained still. For several seconds, the room was wrapped only in the sound of wind brushing against the windows and the steady ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. At last I turned to her, smiling softly, as if sharing a secret just between the two of us. "You have a beautiful voice," I whispered. Sophia lowered her head, her fingers picking at the hem of her dress. My mother said, "I sing like her." I touched her back gently, offering no additional words. None were needed. The next day, when I arrived, Daniel was in the sitting room. He rarely appeared during lessons, but today he was waiting. When I passed by, he stood. "Do you have a moment?" he asked. I nodded and followed him into the library, a dark wood-paneled room rich with the scent of leather and old pages, the warm lamplight pooling softly along the shelves. Daniel sat down and looked directly at me. "Yesterday Sophia told me she sang again. I do not know what happened, but you have done what more than a year of therapy could not." I opened my mouth to speak, but he raised a quiet hand. "I know I offered a generous salary, but if you need anything more, anything at all, you only have to ask. You are not just teaching my daughter music. You are bringing her back to life." I did not need more money, but I understood that his gratitude came from a place inside him that was fragile and raw, a father watching his daughter return from a long, cold distance. When I returned to the music room, Sophia was already at the piano, her hands resting on the keys. She looked at me, her eyes shimmering, and whispered like someone making a promise. "Today we sing twice." I nodded and began counting the rhythm, my heart as light as a bird lifting itself from sorrow. From the moment Sophia began singing, the entire Romano household shifted. Each time I came, the mansion felt brighter, less burdened by silence, and the staff moved with a softness I had not seen before. Maria, especially, often left lavender-scented handkerchiefs beside the piano, as if offering little blessings only Sophia could receive. And Daniel Romano, the powerful, quiet man who remained an enigma, seemed to grow more present in the spaces where he previously lingered only in shadow. He never spoke much, but he appeared at strangely perfect moments, as though he always knew the precise shape of his daughter's day. Once, when Sophia, attempted a more challenging ballad, I heard the faintest footsteps pause outside the hallway. When the music ended and Sophia beamed with pride, I caught a glimpse of Daniel's silhouette drifting away like a breeze. He did not enter. He did not speak, but I knew he had been listening. Another afternoon, as I was leaving, rain began falling, soft and cold. Marco offered to take me home, but Daniel appeared unexpectedly and said he would drive. In the car, he stayed mostly silent, one hand gripping the wheel, his gaze steady on the road ahead. The silence between us felt full, not empty. As we neared my apartment complex, he asked a question so sudden it took me several seconds to understand. "Do you remember the lullaby from that night? The one you sang in the park?" I nodded, though he did not look at me. "What is it called?" I told him the Italian name, then translated it into English. "Lullaby of the Moon." Daniel's mouth shifted slightly. Not quite a smile. Not quite a memory, something lingering in between. "Alessia sang that to Sophia every night. I never heard anyone else sing it. When you sang it that day, I thought I was dreaming." I turned toward him. His face was angled toward the window, the raindrops streaking down like threads of silver, reflecting the depth in his quiet eyes. There was something in that gaze that kept me from asking more. A sorrow without a name, a shadow that did not welcome light. But from that night onward, I began noticing things I had missed before. In the library, there was a cabinet that was always locked. One evening I passed by and saw Daniel standing before it, a small key in his hand, hesitating a long time before finally opening it in silence. When he turned and saw me across the hall, he offered only a faint nod, but his eyes held something like a warning. Another time, when Sophia sang a short Italian phrase in front of him, I saw him turn away abruptly, his hand tightening into a fist. He was not angry. I knew that much, but something in the sound pierced him in a way he could not bear. It might have been grief. It might have been regret, or something deeper I was not yet allowed to imagine. One evening, after a lesson, Maria invited me to stay for dinner. Daniel was there as well, the first time I ever sat beside him at the long marble dining table under the glittering chandelier. He asked about music, about where I studied, about why I chose teaching over performing professionally. I answered honestly, and he nodded at each response, neither judgmental nor overly curious. But when I mentioned my grandmother and the old Italian songs she had taught me, he went still for a moment, watching me long and searchingly, as though he wanted to ask something but could not bring himself to do it. That night, as I left, I saw him on the second-floor balcony, looking down into the garden where Sophia played beneath the warm lights. He did not call to her. He simply watched, silent and vigilant, like a soul trying to guard the last precious thing it had left. And in that moment I began to understand that Daniel Romano was not only a grieving husband or a devoted father, he was a man holding more untold stories than he knew how to carry. They revealed themselves bit by bit, through glances, through sudden turns away, through silences so deep even music could not fill them. That night the rain fell harder. Charleston rain in October was not the fierce storm of summer, but a steady, bone-chilling drizzle that seemed to seep into everything. I left the Romano mansion later than usual after Sophia begged to repeat the piece twice. Daniel had not appeared at all that day, something rare in recent weeks. Marco was not at the entrance either. I walked alone to my car, turned on the headlights through the blurry veil of rain, and slowly pulled away from the quiet south of broad streets. But within minutes, I sensed something wrong. A black SUV behind me neither passed nor turned. At first I brushed it off as coincidence, but after 4 turns taken in perfect sync with mine, my heartbeat quickened. I switched lanes abruptly, then veered into a narrow street with reflective windows. The SUV followed, maintaining a measured distance as if trained to do exactly that. A cold tension crawled along my spine. I breathed slowly, gripping the wheel, as my mind raced through possibilities. A robber, a deranged stranger, someone who had followed me from the mansion. Or maybe I was not the true target. I thought of Daniel, of Sophia, of the unfinished story surrounding Alessia, the wife who had died, and the lullaby only 2 people in the world had ever sung. I sped up, swerving into an alley near a gas station, then killed the headlights. I held my breath and watched. The SUV slowed and stopped roughly 20 meters away. Its headlights remained on, but no one stepped out. I reached for my phone, but my hands were shaking so hard I nearly dropped it. Call the police? Call Marco? Call Daniel? Before I could decide, the SUV's lights went dark. A tall figure stepped out, wearing a hat, hands tucked inside a long coat. My body locked up. The figure walked toward my car slowly, with the kind of deliberate certainty that made my breath stop in my throat. I locked the doors and clutched the keys like a useless weapon. Just before the stranger reached me, a car horn blared from the intersection. Another vehicle turned the corner, headlights slicing through the rain. The stranger froze, then spun abruptly and hurried back to the SUV. I did not wait. I started the engine, reversed fast, and sped out of the alley as if chased by ghosts. The entire drive home I kept checking the rearview mirror. No one followed, but the feeling of being watched clung to me like cold water. I reached my apartment, slammed the door shut, and slid to the floor, breath shaking as though I had run miles. I did not sleep at all that night. At dawn, I drove to the Romano mansion, earlier than usual, hoping to see Daniel before the lesson, but Marco met me with a tense expression. "He wants to see you," he said, the moment I walked in. I followed him to the library, where Daniel stood beside the fireplace, hands in his pockets, his gaze fixed on the misty window. When he saw me, he did not greet me. "Last night," he said, his voice low and rough, "someone followed you." I nodded. It did not surprise me that he already knew. "I don't know if they were after me or after Sophia," I whispered. "After you," he answered immediately, "but because you are connected to Sophia." A chill swept straight through me. "I need the truth," I said softly. Daniel looked at me, his eyes heavy, not angry, not panicked, but like a man exhausted from hiding things for far too long. "There are things I cannot tell you yet, Emily. Not because I do not trust you, but because they are dangerous." I clenched my fists. "If I am being watched, if Sophia might be in danger, then I need to know." He was silent for a long time before nodding once. "Tomorrow evening, 6 o'clock, stay after the lesson. I will tell you everything." And in that moment I understood that tomorrow night would hold no gentle piano notes, no soft lullabies, no easy truths. It would be the sound of secrets breaking open, of a past unsealed, and perhaps of a door opening into a place where safety no longer existed at all. The lesson that day unfolded in a silence heavier than usual, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Sophia practiced quietly beside me, her small hands tracing familiar notes with a calm focus, until the door opened and Daniel stepped inside. He motioned for Marco to close it, then pointed to the chair near the fireplace. I sat down, my pulse steady but attentive, and Daniel lowered himself into the seat across from me, turning the stem of his wineglass slowly between his fingers. "Alessia knew everything about me." He began, his voice low, worn at the edges. "She met me in Italy, and in that moment I thought that if my life ever had a chance to escape all of it, that chance began the moment she opened her mouth to sing." He paused, setting the glass gently on the table. "I brought her back to America. We had Sophia. I convinced the organization to let me walk away. They agreed, or at least that is what I believed." His voice deepened. "Until one night, Alessia discovered they never intended to let me go. They had been watching me the entire time. She realized that she and Sophia would always be my weakness, always the leverage they could use to control me." Daniel's eyes drifted toward the fire, so she began collecting something: insurance, evidence of their transactions, names, bank accounts, everything that could destroy them. She hid it well, very well. Even I did not know where it was. He exhaled slowly. "One winter night she received a letter. I knew immediately it was immediately. Final warning. They had discovered what she was doing. She packed her things, kissed our little girl, and then she told me the one sentence I will never forget: 'I have to go. I will take the original with me, but I left you a signal. If one day you hear our lullaby again from a stranger, trust that it is destiny. It means the insurance is ready. It means it is time to end all of this. For our daughter." Daniel lifted his gaze to mine. "She disappeared that same night. The organization believed she took the insurance with her and may have died in a staged accident. They stopped searching. And then," I whispered, "I sang that song." "And then you sang that song," he echoed softly, his eyes heavy. "You activated the signal, Emily. You told me the insurance is still here. And it seems you may have alerted them too. Your appearance startled them. They are not sure if Alessia is alive or not, and they do not know who you are. They are probing. I spent the entire night thinking. The things Daniel told me were not easy to accept, even harder to reconcile with the simple life. I knew a music teacher with a predictable schedule and a quiet affection for children who often fidgeted more than they focused. But I had not felt ordinary since that fateful afternoon in the Charleston Park, when I sang an Italian lullaby and watched a little girl with grief-darkened eyes look at me as if something inside her had survived when everything else had shattered. Sophia had entered my life with a softness that struck deeper than force, and I could not turn away from her now, not even knowing the danger that waited ahead. The next morning, when Daniel asked whether I still wanted to teach Sophia, I answered with a single sentence, one that would change everything. I will move in with the two of you. He looked at me for a long time, his gaze no longer guarded but touched with something close to relief. It was not because he needed me close to protect his daughter. It was because he understood that once I crossed this threshold, I was no longer an outsider. Moving into the Romano mansion happened far faster than I expected. Daniel sent people to help pack my things from my small apartment. Marco handled every detail, and Maria prepared a room for me on the second floor next to Sophia's, with a window facing the garden and a neat upright piano waiting in the corner like a quiet companion. On the first morning I woke there, I opened my eyes to the sound of sparrows tapping against the balcony railing and the warm scent of toasted bread drifting from the kitchen. For the first time in years, I felt as if I were living in a home, not merely a place to sleep. Sophia lit up when she learned I was staying. She clung to me, asking if I would sleep in her room, if I could tell her stories before bed, if I would eat breakfast with her every morning. I laughed gently, nodding at each question, seeing in her expression a pure joy I had never witnessed so completely before. We created a new, more flexible schedule. Some lessons took place early in the morning, others after dinner. I taught her not only songs and vocal exercises, but the basics of music theory, how to write notes, how to copy melodies by hand. Sophia learned quickly, maybe because music reconnected her with her mother, or perhaps because she was beginning to find in me a kind of gentle presence she trusted enough to open her heart to. In the evenings, Daniel often appeared after dinner, sitting in the large chair in the corner of the reading room, eyes on his book but ears always tuned to Sophia's playing. Sometimes he looked at me, and his gaze had changed, no longer cold or impenetrable, but softened, warmer, though he remained the quietest man I had ever known. Yet beneath these seemingly peaceful routines, I sensed the currents shifting. Marco began escorting Sophia and me, even on short walks through the garden. The cameras around the house were repositioned. A new staff member arrived without explanation, wandering the halls as though conducting silent checks. And every night, no matter how late, I saw the library lights still shining. Daniel was awake, preparing for something, or waiting for something he feared. I also began noticing things about Sophia. One evening she asked if someone had ever tried to look through her bedroom window. I did not want to frighten her, so I told her gently that the house was very safe. But that night, I checked every window, every lock, every hallway leading to the garden. 1 week after I moved in, Daniel called me to his office. On his desk was a thick folder, and inside were photos I recognized immediately. Some were taken in the park, others near Hammond School. One showed me walking with Sophia, her small hand tucked in mine. I felt a cold shiver crawl up my neck. "They are watching you," Daniel said. "Not to hurt you, but to send a message. That you are now one of us, and if we do not act correctly, you will be the next to pay the price." I looked at him not afraid, only resolute, and answered with a single line. "Then from today forward, I will protect Sophia with you, until everything she fears is gone forever." Daniel nodded, and in that quiet gesture, I understood that I had not simply moved into a house. I had stepped into a family, with all its shadows and its fractured hope, its danger and its tenderness, and I was ready to walk through every part of it, all the way to the end. The days that followed drifted by like a dream without clear edges, suspended somewhere between the lingering notes of the music we practiced and the quiet veil of stillness that always seemed to settle over the Romano mansion like a thin layer of mist. I taught Sophia piano in the mornings, read stories with her in both English and Italian in the afternoons, and in the evenings we brewed chamomile tea and whispered gentle melodies together before bedtime. In those moments, Something strange began to bloom softly inside me, something I could not quite name. It was more than the responsibility of a teacher, more than affection for a child carrying the weight of a wounded past. It was deeper, closer, something that felt unsettlingly like belonging, as if I were living in a home that was becoming mine in ways I had not expected, despite all the secrets it still held. Sophia grew more open each day, no longer shrinking away from strangers or unfamiliar voices. She told me her dreams, small fragments of memory about her mother, moments when the two of them baked together while singing in the kitchen, or winter nights spent listening to poems under the warm glow of a bedside lamp. Whenever she spoke of her mother, she no longer cried. She simply held her worn teddy bear a little tighter and stared out the window as if searching for a figure she still believed might return. I sat beside her during those fragile moments, saying little, letting my hand rest gently on her back, allowing silence to be the comfort she needed. Daniel remained an enigma. He rarely joined these small family rituals, but I could feel his presence at the edges. On some evenings, I noticed the hallway light spilling from Sophia's room when I read to her, and when I stepped out after she had fallen asleep, I often caught the brief silhouette of Daniel turning quietly toward the library. No words, just the quiet truth that he was always near in his own restrained way. Once, after Sophia fell asleep earlier than usual, I found myself sitting in the living room with Daniel, both of us silent for what felt like a long, suspended moment. Then he asked me a question that took me by surprise. "Do you ever feel like this house resembles a family?" I looked over and found his gaze fixed on the large framed photograph hanging on the wall, one where Alessia held Sophia on her lap during a picnic, her hair captured mid-movement by the breeze, her smile radiant and unguarded. I thought for the moment before answering. "It is not complete," I said softly, "but it could become a real family." Daniel nodded slowly, as though listening to the faint echo of a familiar melody he had never stopped to hear. He poured more tea into my cup without speaking, but after that night, something shifted. I began to see him at dinner more often, asking Sophia small questions about her lessons, her games in the garden, or the new pieces she was learning. Sophia looked at her father with a blend of trust and longing, though there was still a delicate distance between them, like a thin fracture in a window pane untouched for years. Once, I saw her start to run toward him as if to throw her arms around him, but then she stopped short, whispering a small greeting instead before returning to her seat. I understood. It was not fear. It was simply a bond interrupted, one that needed more than conversation to be whole again. One night, as I tucked Sophia into bed, she suddenly asked me, "If my mother comes back, will you leave?" The question sliced gently but deeply. I leaned down, touched her hair, and whispered, "I will not leave, no matter what happens." Sophia threw her arms around me, holding on with a desperate tenderness before settling down again, her eyelashes trembling even after her eyes closed. When I stepped into the hall, Daniel was standing there. He did not ask what happened, nor did he look surprised. I suspected he had heard everything. The soft glow from the wall sconce revealed lines on his face I had never noticed before, lines shaped by years spent carrying pain alone. His eyes were no longer stern or unreadable, but softened, almost wounded. I did not know what to say, so I simply whispered, "She misses her mother more than you realize." Daniel did not answer. He nodded once, turning away, but I knew that something inside him had cracked open, another layer of the fortress he had built around himself collapsing quietly. The next morning, Sophia woke looking more tired than usual. She said nothing about the dream, nothing about her mother, only sat quietly at breakfast with her gaze drifting toward the mist-covered garden. I did not press her, but during our lesson, when she placed her small hands on the keys, she suddenly looked at me and asked, "If someone loves you very much but still has to leave, does that mean they do not love you anymore?" My heart tightened. "No," I told her softly. "Sometimes people love us so deeply that they must leave, because staying would hurt us more, and sometimes they go because they have no choice at all." Sophia stayed silent for a while, then nodded. She played that day's piece with a depth I had never heard from her before, each note drawn out like a breath carrying a message into the unseen space where she believed her mother still lingered. I counted each beat beside her, tears slipping down my lips before I could stop them. In her dream, Sophia had called for her mother, and in her waking life, she was still calling, through music, through quiet sorrow, through a fragile hope that one day the person who left would find her way home again. And as for me, I could only hold tightly to this small, aching world, one where a child waited to be loved without condition, and where a father struggled to find his way back to his own heart through the steady rhythm of his daughter's breath. That night the rain fell hard. Wind howled through the cracks of the thick glass panes, creating strange sounds like the faint tapping of someone trying to slip into the edges of sleep. I had just finished singing Sophia to bed, sat for a few more minutes watching her small face soften into the peace of a long, emotional day, then quietly returned to my room. The hallway was dimly lit, the framed paintings trembling slightly as the cold air threaded itself through the old house. I pulled out my notebook, intending to jot down the melody Sophia had played that afternoon, when I heard a soft sound, a faint clatter rising from the first floor, unlike Marco's steps or the gentle routines of Maria checking the lights as she did every night. I held my breath, froze, and listened again. This time it was the back door clicking open, barely audible, yet unmistakable to anyone who was fully awake. Without waiting, I slipped out of my room, closed the door lightly behind me, and moved down the wooden stairs. The hallway lights were off. Only the faint glow from the reading room at the far end cast a thin line across the dark floor. I looked around. Marco was nowhere. Strange. At this hour, he always stationed himself near the security room or patrolled the garden. As I approached the library, I heard whispering mixed with footsteps soft as a cat's. Not someone from the house. Instinct told me that immediately. I backed away, reaching for my phone, intending to call Daniel when the screen lit up. A message from him. Do not go outside. There are intruders in the house. Get Sophia to the safe room. My heart tightened sharply. No questions, no hesitation. I turned and raced up the stairs, each step matching the frantic pounding in my chest. Sophia's door was slightly open. She was still asleep. I rushed in, lifting her with the blanket wrapped around her, whispering into her ear, "Stay asleep, sweetheart. I am right here." She nestled into my shoulder, not quite awake, while I opened the hidden passage leading to the safe room behind the concealed hall. The room was disguised behind a moving wall, camouflaged as bookshelves, accessible only to Daniel and Marco. But 3 days earlier, Daniel had insisted I needed to know the code. The chamber was small, enough for 3 people, equipped with internal communication, a monitor for the security cameras, water, and basic first aid. I settled Sophia on the chair. She stirred, murmuring a familiar name. Mama. My heart broke. I held her tightly, keeping her close. On the small screen, I saw 2 intruders moving through the house. One tall, wearing a rangalao's long coat, holding something that looked like a lock-breaking tool. The other shorter, wearing a hat, his face shadowed, yet his eyes sharp like blades. Marco appeared from the left side of the frame, swift and controlled. He did not shout, did not warn, he lunged. The struggle was brief but brutal. The shorter man went down first, but the taller one broke free, landing a blow that sent Marco crashing into a glass cabinet. I stopped breathing. Then suddenly Daniel appeared. No gun, no yelling, just a steel rod in his hand and an expression I had never seen before. He struck the intruder's arm cleanly, sending the weapon crashing to the floor. Another kick and the man fell. It was over in less than a minute. But to me, it felt like the longest stretch of my life. I turned on the intercom. Daniel's voice came through, urgent but steady. Everything is contained. Stay inside. The police are on their way. I held Sophia, who was now awake and trembling in my arms. She did not cry. She only asked one question, one that hollowed me from the inside. Will Mama come back, Miss Emily? I had no answer, only held her tighter and whispered that she was safe now, that her mother was close in ways she could not see. The safe room door opened only when Daniel tapped 3 times in the agreed rhythm. He stepped in, his eyes immediately going to Sophia before settling on me. In that moment, his gaze no longer belonged to a man haunted by a violent past, but to a father, wholly and fiercely present, and to something else rising slowly between us, wordless, unnamed, yet undeniably real. And I knew that from this night forward, we were no longer 3 people sharing the same roof. We were a family that had stood together at the edge of darkness and stepped out of it whole, even with our hearts covered in quiet bruises. But some bruises do not hurt. They simply remind us of how tightly we once held one another to survive. The next morning, the mansion was quieter than usual. Sophia still slept in my room. I walked into the library and found Daniel staring at an old wooden box on the desk. He gestured for me to sit. His voice was low, not tired anymore, but edged with a cold finality. "Who were they?" I asked. "They were from the organization," Daniel said. "They came looking for the signal, meaning you, and for Alessia's insurance. They were sent to probe." My heart clenched. "So, they will return? Should we leave?" "No," Daniel cut in, his eyes drifting to the wooden box. "They will not return. Because last night, while they were searching, I was searching too." He opened the box. Inside lay nothing but a small USB and a worn leather notebook. "The lullaby," Daniel murmured. "Alessia always said the lullaby was the key. The insurance was hidden in her mother's old piano, beneath the B-flat key, the first note of her lullaby. I never understood. Until last night." I held my breath. "I kept one of them alive," Daniel continued. "Marco is with him in the security room. And 10 minutes ago, I had a call with his superior in Naples." Daniel stood, walked to the fireplace, and threw something into the flames, a single-use phone. I guessed. "I gave them a new agreement," he said, turning back to me, his eyes steady and, for the first time, unburdened. "They erase every file, every connection to the Romano family. In exchange, I will not send copies of this notebook to the Department of Justice." Did they agree? They had no choice. Alessia won, even if she is no longer here. She gave us the path out. He looked at me, and for the first time in many days, I saw the tension in him dissolve. "The final threat," he said softly, "is resolved. It is over. Truly over, Emily. The past is finally behind us." 2 days after my final conversation with Daniel, Sophia suddenly asked for something that left both of us speechless for a few seconds. She wanted to hold a small performance right inside the mansion, just family, the staff, and a few people who had loved her mother. She said it was time for music to speak for her fears, that she wanted her mother to hear her voice, wherever she might be. Daniel looked at his daughter as though he were seeing Alessia reflected in those bright, determined eyes. He said nothing at first, only pulled Sophia into his arms, held her for a long moment, and then nodded. We began preparing. Sophia and I chose simple pieces filled with emotion. There was an Italian ballad she insisted on singing, the same lullaby I had sung the very first time we met in the park. She wanted to end the performance with it, as if closing a circle of memories and opening something new. The large west room was cleaned and rearranged, a small wooden stage built beneath the tall windows overlooking the garden. Maria prepared lemon cookies and iced tea. Marco checked the sound system himself, and Daniel stood quietly in the back, watching everything with an attentiveness that felt almost reverent. By late afternoon, the guests arrived. Only a little more than a dozen people, mostly longtime staff who had served the family since Alessia was alive. I saw several pairs of reddened eyes when Sophia stepped out in her ivory dress, curls pinned back with a single small flower just the way Alessia once liked. She stood at the piano, took a deep breath, and began. The first notes drifted through the room like a soft breeze, delicate and clear enough to crack a heart open. Sophia didn't sing loudly, but every word carried weight, brushing against something tender in each listener. No one spoke, no one turned away. Everyone stood still, as if held in place by the voice of a child carrying her mother's memories and her own fragile new beginnings. When she reached the chorus, she paused and turned to me, giving a tiny nod. I joined her on stage, sat beside her, and let my voice blend into hers. In that harmony, something rose above the melody, something like the soul of the lullaby awakening again, not from grief this time, but from hope. At the back of the room, Daniel stood frozen, his hand clenching and releasing over and over as though the song itself were dissolving years of silence inside him. When the music faded, no one clapped, not because they were unmoved, but because no one dared break the holiness of the moment. Sophia bowed lightly, then ran into my arms, whispering, "I did it." I held her, swallowing the tears burning at the corners of my eyes. When I looked up, Daniel was walking toward us, moving slowly, as if carrying an entire lifetime that had just been set free. He knelt, wrapped his arms around both of us, and whispered 3 words only Sophia and I could hear. "Thank you, sweetheart." It was not only gratitude for the song or the performance. It was gratitude for the life returning to this house. That night, after Sophia fell asleep, Daniel and I sat on the back terrace where the garden lights cast a soft glow across his now unburdened eyes. He said he did not know what the future would bring, but if there was one thing he was certain of, it was that Sophia had begun to heal, not because of time or therapy, but because of her own voice. And I, who had stepped into their world by accident, had become a piece of the music breathing life back into their home. A piece of a song still unfinished but already glowing at its edges. Charleston was overcast that day, but the sky held no rain, only a thin film of mist drifting across the lake behind the mansion, like a veil laid over memories long buried. After dinner, Daniel asked me to walk with him to the back garden. Sophia had fallen asleep early, exhausted from the emotional performance. We walked without speaking, our footsteps tapping lightly against the stone path like notes from an unwritten score. Beneath the old oak tree, he sat on the wooden bench, eyes fixed on the blurred reflection of the moon on the water. "There is something I have never told anyone except Alessia," he began, his voice steady, his gaze deep in the night. "The first time I met her was in Naples, not at a bar, the way people like to imagine, but at a funeral. She sang an old Italian hymn, and her voice sounded like light breaking through grief. I never believed in fate, but that day I knew I would not be able to walk away without speaking to her. I stayed silent, letting him open the door to a part of his life that had been locked away for too many years. Alessia was unlike any woman I had known," he continued, gentle, but never weak. "She looked at me as if she saw every hidden corner I tried to bury. She said I was the saddest man she had ever met, and that I needed to learn how to love myself again. I thought she was naive. Turns out she was right. I was a perfect machine in the world of shadows, but completely lost in the world of emotion. She pulled me out of that darkness not with power, not with force, but with a love so pure it terrified me." His voice wavered. "I never imagined she would leave. Alessia did not leave me. She left the world I dragged into our home. She knew she had no other choice if she wanted Sophia safe. And even though I hated her disappearance, I never blamed her, because if it had been me, I would have done the same." He fell quiet. I watched his hand curl into a fist, then relax again. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small worn paper, unfolding it before handing it to me. "This is the last line Alessia left for me," he said, his eyes locked on mine. I read the single sentence written in Italian. "If you still love me, then live for our daughter." I handed it back gently, overwhelmed by emotions I could not name. Daniel leaned back and exhaled, the sound like a weight sliding off his shoulders after years of being carried in silence. "I lived like a shadow after she left," he said softly. "I was still the father, the employer, the man in charge. But inside, I was nothing but quiet ruins. Until you stepped into Sophia's life. You didn't just bring her back to music. You pulled me out of the room I had locked myself in for so many years." I turned toward him, ready to speak, but he was already looking at me, his gaze softened into something unfamiliar and tender. "I am not promising to be perfect," he said, "and I cannot pretend my past can be discarded easily. But I do know one thing: I do not want to live another day without choosing the chance to begin again. If you will allow it." My heart tightened. In the dim garden light, I saw a very different Daniel. Not the powerful, enigmatic man I had first met, but a husband who still loved, a father relearning how to love, and a man standing at the threshold of something he once believed was gone forever. And without hesitation, I took his hand, because I knew, from that moment on, the past was no longer the weight that crushed him. It was the foundation for the new song we were about to write this time, no longer alone. 3 weeks after the night Daniel told me about Alessia, we took Sophia to Sullivan's Island for a weekend away, a place not far from Charleston, but quiet enough to feel like we were stepping outside the shadows that had been clinging to us. The early spring ocean was cool but not cold, its small waves brushing the shore with a sound as gentle as a piano played from another world. Sophia ran along the sand with delight, collecting shells and tiny stones glimmering under the sun. Daniel and I sat on a wooden bench near a patch of seagrass, saying little, simply watching her as if watching the shape of a future gradually emerging after so much loss. When the sun began to sink, its light shifting from gold to rose to a brilliant orange, Daniel turned toward me, the reflection of dusk shimmering in his eyes like warmth rising after a long storm. "Do you remember the first time we spoke?" he asked, his voice soft as wind skimming the water. I smiled and said, of course, and that he had looked impossibly distant back then. He nodded slightly. At that time he had not allowed himself to trust anyone, had never imagined he would sit here with me and with his daughter. He had lost too much to believe there was anything left worth beginning again. But then I came along, not loud or insistent, simply present, exactly where and when I needed to be. And he realized that sometimes life does not return as a strong wind, but as a lullaby rising out of silence. I did not know how to answer, so I simply squeezed his hand. He reached into his coat and took out a small dark wooden box, not the kind of gleaming engagement ring one might expect, but a simple, slender piece with a polished turquoise stone, round like the pebble Sophia had found earlier that morning. This was the ring his mother wore when she left Italy for America, he said, placing it in my hands. She once told him that when he found someone who made him feel less alone in both thought and silence, he should give them this ring. He believed he understood her the day he heard me sing that old lullaby. And now, sitting beside him after all we had survived, he knew he had found the one. Will you marry me, Emily? The question came without drama or flourish, but it struck my heart like a beautiful chord finally played after a long pause. I did not cry or tremble. I simply smiled and nodded. Yes. The word felt as light as a single note, yet as complete as a full harmony. Sophia came running toward us from a distance, shell in hand, and when she saw the ring she squealed with delight, asking if I had said yes. Daniel lifted her into his arms and kissed her forehead. Now we are truly a family, he said, and Sophia's eyes shone brighter than the sea itself. When we left the beach, the sun had slipped beneath the horizon, leaving a long streak of light across the water like a silent blessing. I walked between the two of them, my left hand bearing the turquoise ring that now carried the meaning of a long journey through darkness. And for the first time in my life, I no longer feared what the future might bring, because whatever lay ahead, I knew I would have Daniel, Sophia, and the gentle music that lived within us, a song without end. The wedding was held in the garden behind the Romano estate, the same place that had seen Sophia's first brave steps back into the world, the same place where Daniel had spent countless hours in silence trying to hear himself again after years of being lost. The entire garden was washed in the soft light of early summer, lavender and white daisies lining the stone path, their fragrance drifting like quiet blessings through the air. Marco and Maria arranged everything with unexpected help from Sophia, who insisted on drawing every wedding invitation herself. In her drawing, I wore a white dress and held Daniel's hand beneath the great oak tree, a sky full of musical notes floating above us. I cried when I saw it, not because of its childish lines, but because it captured perfectly the simple dream Sophia had carried for years. A real family, with laughter, music, and nights no longer haunted by broken memories. The ceremony took place in the afternoon, when the sunlight reached its most tender point. I wore an ivory dress, simple and unadorned, falling softly like a quiet stream winding through a forest. Daniel wore a dark gray suit without a tie, his silvering hair brushed neatly but still retaining the ruggedness that made him feel unmistakably himself. Sophia was the only bridesmaid, her dress matching mine except smaller and tied with a pale blue bow. She held a tiny bouquet, her eyes bright as morning stars. When I walked between the rows of guests, everyone rose, but I saw only one person, Daniel. He did not look at me as a groom looks at a bride, but as a man witnessing a miracle he never dared to believe would return to him. We stood beneath a canopy of blooming purple flowers, the air so still we could hear the wind moving gently through the leaves. Our officiant was not a priest or a judge, but Maria, who had witnessed the breaking and rebuilding of this family from its very beginning. Her voice trembled slightly as she read the vows, but her eyes were steady, carrying a lifetime of loyalty and hope for this home. When Daniel slipped the ring onto my finger, he whispered words only I could hear, his voice rough but certain. We will rewrite our lives from this chapter forward with 2 hands and 1 shared heart. I squeezed his hand in response, letting it be my promise. Sophia handed us the rings, and when the ceremony ended, she was the first to shout, "Mama and Papa are married." Applause rose around us, warm, full, sincere, not merely for a wedding, but for the long, fragile journey that had brought us here. That evening, under candlelight and the soft music of the old piano in the living room, Daniel and I danced our first dance. There were no bright lights, no loud songs, Only Sophia at the piano playing the lullaby from years before, but now it was no longer a farewell. It was the opening line of a new dream, a dream the three of us somehow built from broken pieces. Later that night, after Sophia fell asleep in her room overflowing with fresh flowers, Daniel and I stood on the terrace, hand in hand, the breeze carrying the scent of new grass and distant city sounds. He turned toward me, said nothing, and pressed a soft kiss to my forehead. And in that quiet moment I knew everything had finally come to rest. No more fear, no more past weighing upon us. Only a family, a home, and a melody that had never sounded so beautiful. The journey to Italy began on a bright June morning when Sophia ran into the living room with her little fox-shaped backpack bouncing on her shoulders and her eyes shining as if she had just discovered treasure. She announced she was ready for the adventure and asked whether Naples had sweets like Charleston. Daniel sat in the old chair by the window, a book in his hand but his eyes following every movement of his daughter, as though he still could not fully believe that the dream he had carried for so many years had finally come true. The last time he had stepped on Italian soil had been a trip no one knew about, no one waited for, and no hope accompanied. This time he was returning with his wife and daughter, carrying love, peace, and a past that was finally ready to close. We landed in Rome and continued by train to the south. Through the window, the scenery shifted from city rhythms to olive fields, green vineyard hills, and small villages scattered along the slopes like unfinished fairy tales. Sophia pressed her face to the glass, asking questions about everything, from why the houses had red roofs to why people drank coffee from tiny cups. Daniel could not answer all of them, but he smiled, a rare smile he had long buried out of fear that joy might be swallowed by pain. When we reached Naples, dusk was beginning to fall. The air carried the scent of sea salt and a faint trace of Amalfi lemons drifting from the stalls along the narrow streets. Daniel paused for Eponys, a long time in front of a quiet alley where an old church once stood, the place he said he first met Alessia. None of us spoke. He simply held my hand tighter, and I understood that his memories were rising again not as wounds, but as something that needed to be held one last time. The next morning, we traveled to the small village where Daniel's mother had lived before coming to America. Moss-covered stone walls, church bells ringing each morning, and elderly people sitting in their doorways. All of it delighted Sophia so much that she refused to put down her little camera, determined to record every moment. We were guided to an old house on a hillside, the one Daniel had lived in as a child. He stood there for a long time, his gaze resting on the cracked bricks as his hand brushed the weathered wall. There, beneath the soft midday sun, he told Sophia about her great-grandmother, about the days when he hid from gunfire in the streets by crawling under the table and humming an old Italian lullaby. Sophia fell silent, then suddenly began to sing that same lullaby, her voice clear and full of hope. Daniel did not hide the tear rolling down his cheek, and I knew it was the first time in many years he truly felt forgiven. We spent 3 days in Naples, visited Alessia's resting place, and left a small sheet of music Sophia had written, her handwriting messy but full of love. She said it was so her mother would know she still sang, and always would, no matter where her mother was. On the way back, Sophia fell asleep in my arms, her hand still holding tightly to the photograph of the three of us in front of the old house. Daniel placed his hand on my shoulder and gave a light squeeze, a silent thank you, and I understood that this journey was not only a return, it was the final step in letting go. So when we came back to Charleston, we did not bring home the weight of the past, but instead the stories that had finally been told, their endings gentle as late summer, Italian sunlight. One chapter had closed, and another waited ahead, steady and soft as the heartbeat of someone who had finally found his rhythm again. When we returned to Charleston, the sky at dusk glowed like a tender greeting from a place we had once called home. The ocean breeze carried the familiar scent of salt and warmth, and the streets and trees seemed unchanged despite our long absence. But inside each of us, everything had shifted. Daniel no longer moved with the heavy steps he once had. His eyes were brighter, calmer, as though he had finally closed a chapter filled with turmoil. Sophia, after Italy, seemed strangely mature. She not only sang better but composed little pieces, sometimes just a few notes, yet filled with emotion. And I, watching the old house appear between the long afternoon shadows, felt something settle gently inside my heart. It was the place I had first entered with hesitation, thinking I would leave after a few weeks of teaching music to a quiet, guarded child, Yet now I was returning as someone who belonged there, woven into the fabric of that home. On our first night back, we sat together in the living room with nothing elaborate, just cups of tea, the soft notes of the familiar piano, and old stories retold in voices that no longer trembled. Daniel opened a small wooden box holding the keepsakes he had brought from Italy. Inside were an unsent letter from his mother, a worn wooden cross, and a handkerchief embroidered with the first letter of Alessia's name. He handed it to Sophia and told her it was a gift from the grandmother she had never met, but whose blood she carried. Sophia pressed the handkerchief to her cheek, as though it were the closest way to touch a memory she had never lived. I had once believed music was only a teaching tool, a method for passing on knowledge. But through everything, I learned that music is the one language that can gather wounded souls together, the small lantern that lights the way out of even the most painful corners of memory. I learned that healing does not come from grand gestures, but from patience, from forgiveness, and from love deep enough to accept both the shadow and the light in someone's heart. Life is full of loss, but it also offers countless chances to begin again if we are brave enough to keep walking. And my friend, if you have listened all the way to the end of this story, we would truly love to hear your thoughts. How did Emily, Daniel, and Sophia's journey make you feel? Did it remind you of something from your own life? Do you believe that sometimes the moments we stumble into by accident become the turning points that change everything? We would be grateful to hear what your heart has to say. Please share with us by leaving a comment below. And if this story touched you, do not forget to subscribe to our channel so you can join us for more heartfelt, human stories each day. Your like and share not only help spread something gentle into the world, but also give us the strength to continue creating videos that reach deeply into the hearts of our viewers. Thank you for spending your precious time with us. We hope you stay healthy, live joyfully and peacefully each day, and always find hope, even on the most tiring days. Goodbye for now, and we look forward to seeing you in the next video.